The air in the Dust Devil Saloon hangs thick with the stench of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair. A rough-hewn platform stands near the bar, and on it, a young woman, barely 19, trembles. Her name is Ilara, though no one here cares for names, only for the price she might fetch. Jedediah Sykes, the saloon's owner, a man whose girth is matched only by his cruelty, leers at her. His voice, like gravel gargled with whiskey, booms, "All right, gents. Fresh arrival, bit skinny, but trainable, who'll start the bidding for a year of her labor, good for scrubbing, serving, and warming a lonely man's bed if you're persuasive enough." A wave of coarse laughter ripples through the assembled miners, drifters, and hard-luck cowboys. Ilara squeezes her eyes shut, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer, a plea to a god she fears has abandoned her in this desolate corner of the Arizona territory. She can feel Silas Blackwood's eyes on her, a man known even in this den of rough characters for his particular brand of brutality, his current saloon girl bearing the faded map of his temper on her arms and face. Blackwood, owner of the rival establishment, the Serpent's Coil, is known to acquire his staff with a callous disregard for anything but their ability to endure. His smile is a gash in his shadowed face as he calls out a paltry sum, confident no one will challenge him for such damaged goods. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. Sykes is about to bring down his makeshift gavel, a dusty beer bottle, when a different voice, calm and clear, cuts through the grimy atmosphere. "I believe the young woman has more worth than that." Every head turns. Standing near the doorway, a man of unassuming appearance, his clothes dusty from travel but clean, his face etched with a quiet solemnity, observes the scene. He's no cowboy, no miner. There's a worn Bible tucked into his saddlebag just outside. He is Josiah Keyes, a preacher, though he rarely announces it. He'd come into the saloon seeking only information about the road ahead, not a soul to save. Yet, here he was. Sykes scoffs. "Well, looky here, parson. Got an opinion on market values, do ya?" Silas Blackwood's eyes narrow, a flicker of predatory amusement in their depths. "Stay out of this, Sky Pilot. This ain't your concern." Josiah's gaze doesn't waver from Ilara, seeing not merchandise, but a terrified human being. And with 3 words that stunned the room into silence, he declared, "I'll double it." His life and hers were irrevocably changed. The journey that had brought Ilara to the auction block in Benton's Gulch had been a cascade of misfortunes. Orphaned by cholera 2 years prior, she had drifted from one precarious situation to another, her small inheritance dwindling, her hopes fading with each closed door. A vague promise of work as a seamstress in a respectable establishment further west had lured her onto a stagecoach, only for the establishment to turn out to be Jedediah Sykes' saloon, and the work a debt she could never repay. She was, in essence, his property until he tired of her or sold her on. Her prayers in the preceding days had been fervent, a desperate plea for deliverance from the leering eyes and grasping hands, from the future she saw reflected in the haunted gaze of the other women who toiled there. Josiah Keyes, for his part, was a man wrestling with his own demons, though they were of a different sort. Once the pastor of a small congregation back east, a tragedy he rarely spoke of had shaken his faith in organized religion, though not in God himself. He now wandered the territories, speaking when invited, offering comfort where he could, living by a stark, personal moral code that often put him at odds with the rough justice of the frontier. He hadn't intended to enter the Dust Devil. He typically avoided such places, finding them monuments to human folly. But he'd heard Sykes was the only one who knew if the northern pass was still open after the early snows. He'd expected to find coarse talk and cheap whiskey, not a human soul being bartered like a head of cattle. The sight of Ilara, small and terrified, had struck a chord deep within him, a sense of righteous anger he hadn't felt in years. His bid was impulsive, an act of defiance against the casual cruelty of the world, a world he felt he had too often failed. The saloon owner, Sykes, after his initial shock, quickly saw an opportunity for profit. Silas Blackwood, however, was incensed. "You ain't got the coin for that, preacher," Blackwood snarled, his hand instinctively moving towards the Colt at his hip. Sykes, ever the opportunist, intervened. Now, Silas, money's money. If the parson here can pay, she's his." Josiah met Blackwood's glare without flinching. He reached into an inner pocket and produced a worn leather pouch. He counted out the coins, the amount nearly depleting his meager savings, and laid them on the stained countertop. The clink of silver was a stark sound in the suddenly hushed saloon. Sykes greedily scooped up the money. "Sold, to the man of God," he declared with a mocking bow. Blackwood spat on the floor. "You'll regret this, preacher, both of you." His eyes, cold and reptilian, lingered on Ilara with an unspoken threat that sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Josiah gently took Ilara's arm. "Come, child," he said, his voice softer now. She flinched at his touch but then looked up at him, seeing something in his weary eyes that was not unkindness. It was pity, resolve. She couldn't name it, but it wasn't the predatory gleam she was used to. He led her out of the dust devil, away from the jeers and the suffocating despair. The late afternoon sun felt almost like a benediction on her skin after the perpetual gloom of the saloon. He had bought her, but what did that mean? Was she simply trading one master for another, albeit one who spoke in gentler tones? Her prayer had been answered, but the nature of that answer was a terrifying unknown. They stood in the dusty street, the sounds of Benton's Gulch, a raucous piano, distant shouts, the creak of a wagon, swirling around them. Ilara clutched her threadbare shawl, her gaze fixed on the preacher's worn boots. Josiah cleared his throat, the silence stretching awkwardly between them. He wasn't a man accustomed to such transactions, nor to the sudden, weighty responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. He had acted on an impulse, a deep-seated conviction that what he had witnessed was an abomination. Now, the practicalities of his actions began to assert themselves. I am Josiah Keyes," he said finally. "I meant you no harm in there. What Sykes and Blackwood were doing was wrong." Ilara nodded mutely, her throat too tight for words. She still couldn't meet his eyes. Years of harsh treatment had taught her that men's intentions were rarely what they seemed, especially when they paid for a woman. "I have no claim on you, miss." "Ilara," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after weeks of being called girl or worse. "Miss Ilara," he continued, a touch of formality in his tone. "That money was to remove you from that situation, not to purchase your servitude. You are free." Freedom. The word hung in the air, an impossible concept. Free to do what? Go where? She had nothing, knew no one. The small sack containing her few pitiful belongings was still back at the saloon, likely already pilfered. Seeing the confusion and fear in her eyes, Josiah's brow furrowed with concern. "Is there somewhere you can go? Family? Friends?" Ilara shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "No one, sir. Not anymore." The weight of his decision settled more heavily upon him. He couldn't simply abandon her here. Blackwood's threat had been genuine. The man was known for his vindictiveness. and Sykes would feel no loyalty to her now that she was no longer his to profit from. Benton's Gulch was no place for a young woman alone and unprotected. He thought of the small, struggling mission church in the next town, Oakhaven, run by an elderly couple, the Wards. Perhaps they could offer her shelter, find her decent work. It was a day's ride at least. "There's a town, Oakhaven, about a day from here," he said slowly. "I know some good people there. Perhaps they can help. Until then, well, we need to find you a safe place for the night, and some food." He glanced around. The only respectable-looking establishment was Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, but he doubted she'd welcome a woman straight from the dust devil, even escorted by a preacher. The questions, the knowing glances, would be unbearable for Ilara. Suddenly, Silas Blackwood emerged from the saloon across the street, the serpent's coil. He didn't approach them, just stood there, watching, a malevolent presence. He casually struck a match on his thumbnail and lit a cheroot, the smoke curling upwards like a dark omen. Ilara instinctively shrank closer to Josiah. His jaw tightened. This was not going to be simple. "We should move," he said quietly. He led her towards the livery, his mind racing. He had a horse. She would have to ride with him. It was unconventional, potentially scandalous, but better than leaving her to Blackwood's mercy. At the livery, he arranged for his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Patience, to be saddled. He purchased a few supplies, a canteen, some jerky, a cheap blanket. Ilara watched him, silent and wary, like a startled deer ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. When he offered her a piece of jerky, she took it with trembling fingers, her eyes downcast. It was the first kindness she'd received in weeks that didn't come with an unspoken price. As they prepared to leave Benton's Gulch, riding double on Patience, Josiah felt the stares of the townsfolk. He saw the smirks, heard the whispered comments. A preacher, riding out of town with a saloon girl. The assumptions were ugly but inevitable. He ignored them, his focus on getting Ilara to safety. He was acutely aware of her slight weight behind him, her hands hesitantly resting on his saddlebags for balance. He tried to make his back a reassuring presence, a bulwark against the world that had treated her so cruelly. The catalyst for their forced proximity was Silas Blackwood's venomous interest and the town's indifference. Josiah knew his impulsive act had bound him to her, at least for now. He had intervened to free her, but that freedom was a fragile thing, easily crushed in this harsh land without protection. His answer to her prayer was not just the money paid, but the journey they were now undertaking, a journey into an uncertain future where his commitment to her safety would be tested at every turn. The trail to Oakhaven was rugged and dusty, winding through sun-baked hills dotted with saguaro and brittlebush. They rode mostly in silence. Josiah was not a man given to idle chatter, and Ilara seemed too overwhelmed, or perhaps too afraid, to speak. He would occasionally point out a landmark or offer her water from the canteen, his voice gentle, trying to put her at ease. She would respond with a soft, "Thank you, sir," her gaze rarely lifting from her lap or the horse's mane. He learned more from her posture, the way she tensed whenever they heard another rider in the distance, the slight tremor in her hands, than from any words she might have spoken. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the pallor beneath the grime on her skin. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Josiah found a sheltered spot in a small ravine, near a trickle of a stream. "We'll make camp here for the night," he announced. Ilara slid off Patience, her legs unsteady. He dismounted and began to unsaddle the horse, his movements economical and practiced. He built a small fire, more for cheer than for warmth in the still balmy evening. He shared his meager rations with her, more jerky, and a couple of hard biscuits. She ate slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure she was truly allowed to. "You should get some rest," he said, gesturing to the blanket he'd spread near the fire. "I'll keep watch." She looked at him then, a flicker of something, surprise, gratitude, in her eyes. You don't have to, sir. I mean." He understood her unspoken fear. "You are safe with me, Miss Ilara," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I gave my word, not just to Sykes, but to my God. You have nothing to fear from me." He saw the doubt still lingering, but also a sliver of nascent trust. She lay down on the blanket, curling up into a small ball, her back to him. Josiah sat by the fire, his Bible open on his lap, though he found it hard to concentrate. His thoughts kept returning to the girl sleeping a few feet away, to the darkness she had endured, and to the uncertain path ahead. He was a preacher, a man of God, yet he felt a fierce, almost primal protectiveness towards her that went beyond mere Christian charity. It troubled him, this intensity of feeling, but he couldn't deny it. Silas Blackwood's face, cruel and determined, kept intruding on his prayers. The man was not one to be easily thwarted. The next morning they were on the trail early. Ilara seemed a little less tense, the night having passed without incident. She even ventured a few questions about Oakhaven, about the wards. Josiah answered her patiently, describing the small, quiet town and the elderly couple who ran the mission with unwavering kindness. He didn't mention his own past, his own reasons for being a wanderer. Some burdens were best carried alone. Midday, as they watered patience at a shallow creek, they heard the sound of approaching horses, several, by the sound of it, moving fast. Josiah's hand instinctively went to the old peacemaker he wore holstered low on his hip, a relic from a past he tried to forget, but a necessity in these lands. Ilara's eyes widened in fear. "Get behind those rocks," he commanded quietly, pushing her gently towards a cluster of boulders. 3 riders burst around a bend in the trail. At their head was Silas Blackwood, a cruel smile twisting his lips. With him were 2 of his brutish-looking henchmen. "Well, well, preacher," Blackwood called out, reining in his horse. "Fancy meeting you here. Lost your way?" His eyes scanned the surroundings, clearly looking for Ilara. "We're not lost, Blackwood," Josiah said, his voice dangerously calm, "and we're not looking for company. I think you have something that belongs to me," Blackwood said, his smile fading. "Or rather, something that belongs to Sykes, and he's reconsidered the sale. Seems he was cheated." "The deal was done, witnessed by half your town," Josiah countered, his gaze steady. "She's not for sale, not to you, not to anyone." "She's a runaway," Blackwood sneered. "A thief, stole from Sykes. I'm just here to return his property." Ilara, hidden behind the rocks, gasped. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but one that could easily be believed in a land where women like her had few rights and fewer defenders. "You're a liar, Blackwood," Josiah stated flatly. Blackwood chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound. "Strong words, preacher. Maybe you'd like to discuss it further, or perhaps the girl would like to come out and tell her side. No? Pity." He gestured to his men. "Find her." One of the henchmen started to dismount, but Josiah drew his peacemaker with a speed that belied his clerical appearance. The click of the hammer being cocked was loud in the sudden stillness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice now hard as iron. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected this. The preacher was armed, and clearly not afraid to use his weapon. "You'd shoot a man over a saloon whore, preacher," Blackwood taunted, trying to regain the upper hand. "I'd defend an innocent from a jackal, yes." Josiah replied, his gaze unwavering. "Now I suggest you and your friends turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. There's nothing for you here." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was a palpable thing, thick enough to cut. Blackwood stared at Josiah, weighing his options. He had the numbers, but the preacher had the drop on his man, and there was a look in Keyes's eyes that Blackwood hadn't anticipated, a cold, resolute fury. Finally, with a frustrated curse, Blackwood signaled his men. "This ain't over, preacher." He snarled, "You can't protect her forever." They wheeled their horses around and galloped back down the trail, leaving a cloud of dust and resentment in their wake. Josiah kept his gun trained on them until they were out of sight. Only then did he lower it, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He turned to Ilara, who emerged from behind the rocks, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, awe perhaps. She had seen him not just as a kind man, but as a protector, a man willing to stand against violence for her sake. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice regaining its usual gentleness. She nodded, still too shaken to speak. He saw the way she looked at him, and it made him uncomfortable. He was no hero. He was just a man trying to do the right thing, often clumsily. "We need to keep moving," he said. "Oakhaven is still a few hours away. He won't give up easily." They rode on, the earlier, fragile ease between them replaced by a new awareness. Ilara, for the first time, felt a flicker of hope that was more than just a desperate wish. This man, this quiet preacher, was a shield. But she also understood the danger he had placed himself in for her. Blackwood's threat, "You can't protect her forever," echoed in her mind. What would happen when they reached Oakhaven? Would the wards truly be able to keep her safe from a man like Silas Blackwood? The encounter with Blackwood had changed something fundamental between them. Ilara no longer saw Josiah merely as a benevolent rescuer, but as a man of unexpected steel. She found herself watching him more closely, noticing the way his weathered hands handled the reins with quiet competence, the lines of weariness around his eyes that also held a deep well of compassion. She began to speak a little more, offering observations about the landscape, asking tentative questions about his travels. He, in turn, listened patiently, his replies thoughtful. He never pried into her past beyond what she volunteered, which was little. The shame of her experiences in Benton's Gulch was a heavy cloak she couldn't easily shed. One evening, as they made camp, she found a tear in his spare shirt while repacking his saddlebag for him. Without a word, she retrieved a small sewing kit from her own meager bundle, one of the few possessions she'd managed to salvage from her journey before Sykes had confiscated everything else. It had been her mother's. She sat by the firelight, her fingers, surprisingly nimble despite the rough work they'd been forced to do, carefully mending the fabric. Josiah watched her, a strange ache in his chest. It was such a simple domestic act, yet it spoke volumes of a quiet dignity, a resilience he found deeply moving. He saw not a saloon girl, but a young woman with an inherent grace trying to reclaim a piece of normalcy in a world that had offered her none. He learned that she could read a little, taught by her mother, and that she knew a surprising amount about herbs and wildflowers, remnants of a childhood spent in greener, gentler places. They reached Oakhaven late the next afternoon. It was a small, dusty settlement, quieter and less overtly hostile than Benton's Gulch, but still bearing the marks of frontier hardship. The mission, run by Elijah and Martha Ward, was a modest adobe building at the edge of town, with a neatly tended vegetable garden. The Wards were an elderly couple, their faces kind, their eyes reflecting a lifetime of service and quiet faith. Josiah explained Ilara's situation in carefully chosen words. omitting the ugliest details but making her vulnerability clear. Martha Ward, a woman whose warmth was as comforting as a winter fire, immediately took Ilara under her wing. "You poor child," she clucked, bustling Ilara inside, offering her a seat, a cool drink of water, and the promise of a hot meal and a clean bed. Elijah Ward, a man of few words but deep empathy, shook Josiah's hand firmly. "You did a good thing, Josiah, a truly Christian act." For a few days, a fragile peace settled over them. Ilara helped Martha in the garden and with household chores, her natural diligence and quiet gratitude endearing her to the old woman. Josiah stayed on, ostensibly to wrest patience and resupply, but also, he admitted to himself, to ensure Ilara was truly safe and settled. He helped Elijah with repairs around the mission, the physical labor, a welcome distraction from his own restless thoughts. He saw the color return to Ilara's cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes begin to recede, replaced by a cautious hope. Yet, the shadow of Silas Blackwood loomed. Oakhaven was not so far from Benton's Gulch that his influence couldn't reach. One afternoon, the town marshal, a portly, self-important man named Henderson, paid a visit to the mission. He wasn't alone. With him was a smirking, confident Silas Blackwood. "Afternoon, preacher, Wards," Henderson said, his eyes flicking dismissively towards Ilara, who was shelling peas on the porch with Martha. "Mr. Blackwood here has lodged a formal complaint. Says this girl, Ilara, is a runaway indentured servant. Skipped out on a contract with Mr. Sykes back in Benton's Gulch. He's got papers." Blackwood produced a sheaf of documents, which Henderson perused with an air of officious gravity. "These papers are a fraud," Josiah stated, stepping forward, his voice low and controlled. "She was sold under duress, and I paid her price in full. She is a free woman." "Now, preacher," Henderson said, puffing out his chest, "the law is the law. Sykes claims the money you paid was merely a down payment, that you absconded with his employee before the full terms were met. He's assigned the debt and the contract to Mr. Plashen and Afar. Blackwood here. It was an outrageous lie, a blatant manipulation, but Blackwood had clearly greased the right palms. Sykes was likely too scared of Blackwood to contradict him, or had been paid off. "This is an injustice," Martha Ward declared, her voice trembling with indignation. Ilara had gone deathly pale, her hands frozen above the bowl of peas. Blackwood smirked. "Justice is what the law says it is, ma'am, and the law says the girl comes with me, unless, of course, the outstanding debt can be settled. A considerable sum, I assure you." He named an amount that was impossibly large, far more than the original sale price. Josiah looked at Ilara, at the terror that had resurfaced in her eyes, extinguishing the fragile light he had seen rekindled there. He looked at Blackwood's triumphant leer, at Henderson's indifferent complicity. His attempt to secure her freedom through conventional means had failed. Blackwood had found a way to use the letter of the law, however twisted, to serve his vile purposes. The society that should have protected her was, instead, sanctioning her torment. He felt a cold anger, a despair, but beneath it, a stubborn resolve began to harden. Her prayer had been for deliverance. His initial answer had been a rescue. Now, perhaps, a different, more radical answer was required. The thought that began to form in his mind was startling, unconventional, and for a man of his calling, deeply challenging. The marshal gave them an ultimatum: produce Ilara or the exorbitant sum Blackwood demanded by noon the next day, or he would be forced to uphold the law and remand her to Blackwood's custody. The threat hung heavy in the air long after Henderson and a gloating Blackwood departed. Martha Ward wept openly, while Elijah paced the small mission room, his face grim. Ilara sat stone still, a statue of despair, the hope that had briefly flowered within her crushed. Josiah watched her, his heart aching. He had brought her here, promising safety, and instead, he had led her into a more sophisticated trap. Blackwood hadn't needed force of arms when he could manipulate the law to his advantage. The wards, for all their goodness, were powerless against such corruption. They had no money, no influence. And Josiah himself, his savings were depleted. He had nothing left to offer in terms of material wealth. He spent that night in agonizing deliberation, pacing under the cold desert stars, his Bible clutched in his hand. He prayed for guidance, for a way out of this morass, a way to honor his promise to protect Ilara. The conventional paths were closed. Charity had failed. Defiance with a gun would only lead to bloodshed and likely his own death, leaving Ilara even more vulnerable. What was left? The answer, when it came, was so unexpected, so contrary to his every instinct as a minister of the gospel, that he initially recoiled from it. Marriage. If Ilara were his wife, Blackwood's claim of indenture, of her being property to be bought and sold or reclaimed for debt, would be significantly weakened, if not entirely nullified. A wife was not a servant to be traded. A husband had legal rights, protections. It was a drastic, almost unthinkable solution. A marriage of convenience, a legal shield forged in desperation. It would be a sham in the eyes of God, as a holy sacrament founded on love and mutual commitment. Yet, could it be a righteous act in the eyes of God if it saved an innocent soul from a terrible fate? He wrestled with his conscience, with years of doctrine, with the very core of his beliefs. This wasn't how he envisioned answering a prayer. This wasn't what Ilara would have prayed for. But her prayers were for deliverance, and perhaps God worked in ways more complex and challenging than he could fathom. As dawn approached, his decision solidified. It was a sacrifice, yes, a sacrifice of his reputation, perhaps, among those who would not understand. A sacrifice of his own solitary life, now bound to another in the most intimate legal sense. But what was that compared to Ilara's safety, her very life and spirit, which Blackwood would surely crush? He found Ilara in the small mission chapel, kneeling before the simple wooden altar, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He approached her quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to propose. "Ilara," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with despair. "There's no hope, is there, Mr. Keyes? He'll take me." Josiah knelt beside her. "There is one way, perhaps. It is not an easy path, and it is not what either of us would have chosen, but it might be the only way to protect you." He explained his idea, his voice low and earnest, laying out the legal protection marriage would offer. He saw the shock on her face, the disbelief, then a dawning, desperate consideration. "Marry you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But why would you do such a thing, sir? For me?" "Because Blackwood will not stop," Josiah said, his gaze steady. "Because the law, as it stands, offers you no other shield. This would not be a marriage in the true sense, Ilara, not born of affection, though I hold you in the highest esteem. It would be a legal contract, a fortress to keep you safe. I would expect nothing from you, only that you allow me to offer you this protection. Afterward, when you are truly secure, if you wish it, we can seek an annulment, go our separate ways. But for now, it is the only weapon I have left to fight him." He saw the internal struggle in her eyes. The idea was monstrous, yet it was also a lifeline. To be bound to this kind, honorable man, even in such a strange pact, was infinitely preferable to the fate that awaited her with Blackwood. She thought of his quiet strength, his unwavering defense of her, the respect he had shown her when no one else had. Slowly, she nodded. If you believe it is the only way, Mr. Keyes, then I accept, and I thank you. Her voice was small but firm. A terrible choice, yet a choice nonetheless. And in that choice, a sliver of her agency, so long denied, returned. Josiah knew they had to act quickly. He spoke with Elijah Ward, who, after his initial astonishment, understood the desperate necessity of the plan. As an ordained minister, Elijah could perform the ceremony. It would be a quiet, rushed affair, but legally binding. Martha, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and admiration for Josiah's sacrifice, helped Elara prepare. She found a simple, clean dress for her, brushed her hair, her touch gentle and motherly. There were no joyous preparations, no happy anticipation, only a grim resolve. Word, however, travels fast in a small town. By mid-morning, as they stood before Elijah in the mission chapel, Josiah in his dusty preacher's coat, Elara pale but resolute in her borrowed dress, Marshal Henderson arrived, Silas Blackwood at his heels, a look of smug triumph on his face. "Hold it right there, Ward," Henderson bellowed, striding into the chapel. "What in tarnation do you think you're doing?" Blackwood smirked. "Trying to pull a fast one, preacher. Thought you could cheat me out of what's mine." Josiah turned to face them, positioning himself slightly in front of Elara. "We are breaking no laws, Marshal. Miss Elara and I are here to be married." Henderson looked flabbergasted. Blackwood's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then rage. "Married? You can't marry her. She's indentured. She's mine." "Is she, Mr. Blackwood?" Josiah's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a cold fury that surprised even himself. "Or is that just a convenient lie you've concocted with a fraudulent contract? A contract that, I assure you, will not stand up to scrutiny once I bring it before a circuit judge, but a marriage contract. That is a sacred and binding vow, recognized by God and law. As my wife, Elara will not be subject to your claims of indenture." Blackwood lunged forward. "You lying, hypocritical son of a—" Josiah didn't flinch. "Careful, Blackwood, assaulting a man of the cloth in his own church, or attempting to interfere with a lawful marriage ceremony. That might attract even more attention from higher authorities than you'd like." Elijah Ward, emboldened by Josiah's stand, stepped forward. "Marshal Henderson, as an ordained minister, I have the right to perform this ceremony. Mr. Keyes and Miss Elara have attested they are free to marry. Unless you have a legitimate, legally binding warrant signed by a judge to prevent this union, not some trumped-up claim from this gentleman, I suggest you allow us to proceed, or you will be the one obstructing justice." Henderson, for all his bluster, was clearly out of his depth. He looked from Blackwood's furious face to Josiah's unwavering calm, to Elijah Ward's newfound resolve. He had no such warrant. Blackwood's papers were looking increasingly flimsy against the prospect of a legal marriage. He was a town marshal, not a territorial judge. "This is an outrage," Blackwood seethed, but there was a note of desperation in his voice now. He saw his prize slipping away. "The only outrage here, Mr. Blackwood," Josiah said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is your relentless persecution of this innocent young woman, your cruelty, your greed. You sought to own her, to break her, but you have failed. She is not property. She is a child of God, and soon she will be my wife." Elara, listening to Josiah's powerful defense, felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost buckled her knees. He was fighting for her, not with fists or guns, but with words, with conviction, with an astonishing sacrifice. For the first time, she dared to meet Blackwood's furious gaze, not with fear, but with a dawning defiance. Josiah turned back to Elijah. "Please, continue, Reverend Ward." Elijah cleared his throat, his gaze firm, and resumed the marriage ceremony. The words, simple and traditional, filled the small chapel, a stark contrast to the venomous fury radiating from Blackwood. When it came time for the vows, Josiah's voice was clear and strong as he pledged to protect and cherish Elara. Elara's voice was softer, barely a whisper, but her "I do" was resolute. As Elijah Ward pronounced them man and wife, a stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by Blackwood's choked sound of rage. He had been outmaneuvered, defeated. The marriage, however unconventional its inception, was legal. Elara was now Mrs. Josiah Keyes. She was no longer a commodity to be bought, sold, or claimed for debt. She was under the protection of her husband. Blackwood spat on the chapel floor, his face contorted with fury. "You haven't heard the last of this, preacher, neither of you." He stormed out, his henchmen trailing behind him like beaten curs. Marshal Henderson, looking thoroughly deflated and uncomfortable, mumbled something about unusual circumstances and quickly followed. The immediate threat was neutralized. The tension in the small chapel slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a profound, if somewhat bewildered, relief. Josiah turned to Elara. Her eyes, though still shadowed with the ordeal, held a new light, a mixture of gratitude, wonder, and a deep, unspoken emotion he couldn't quite name. He gently took her hand. It was cold, but it didn't tremble. Their bond, forged in desperation and sealed by sacred vows, was now a reality. They had chosen each other, in a way, and their shared life, whatever it might hold, had begun. In the quiet aftermath, as the heavy oak door of the chapel closed behind the departed marshal, a profound silence settled, broken only by Martha Ward's soft, relieved sigh. Josiah looked at Elara, truly looked at her, not as a victim to be rescued, but as his wife. The word felt foreign, momentous. Her gaze met his, a hesitant dawn of understanding and gratitude in their depths. The terror that had been her constant companion for so long had receded, replaced by an exhausted calm. He had answered her prayers, not with a gentle whisper of divine comfort, but with a bold, life-altering act of human intervention, a sacrifice that bound them together in ways neither could have foreseen. Elijah Ward cleared his throat, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "Well, son," he said, placing a hand on Josiah's shoulder, "that was unorthodox. But I dare say it was the most righteous sermon I've witnessed in this chapel in many a year." Martha dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "You are a good man, Josiah Keyes, and you, my dear Elara," she said, turning to the young woman, "have found a true protector." There was a subtle shift in the air of Oakhaven that afternoon. The story of the preacher who married the saloon girl to save her from the clutches of Silas Blackwood would become a local legend, and for once, it seemed a few of the townsfolk found themselves siding against a bully and with an unconventional act of mercy. Elara stood straighter, a quiet dignity settling upon her. The label of sold girl had been seared into her, but now another, more powerful title had been bestowed, wife. It was a shield, yes, but as she looked at Josiah, at the quiet strength in his eyes, the compassion that had driven him to such an extraordinary length, she felt the first stirrings of something more than just safety. It was a profound respect, a nascent trust that perhaps this unexpected path might lead not to another form of bondage, but to a different kind of freedom altogether. She had found her voice, not in shouted defiance, but in the quiet "I do" that had sealed her fate to his. Josiah knew their journey was far from over. Blackwood was not a man to forgive or forget. They could not stay in Oakhaven indefinitely. It would place the wards in continued jeopardy. But for now, in this small sunlit chapel, there was a moment of peace, a reprieve. He looked down at Alara's hand, still resting in his. It was a small hand, but it possessed a surprising strength. He thought of her mending his shirt by firelight, her quiet diligence in the ward's garden, her unwavering faith even in the depths of despair. He had set out to save her, to offer her protection according to his understanding of God's will. The answer had been far different, far more personal than he could ever have imagined. He saw her manage a small, tremulous smile, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. It transformed her face, hinting at the woman she could become, free from fear. He'd sought to buy her freedom from a brutal saloon owner. Instead, through an act of desperate faith and unconventional love, he'd found himself bound to a future he hadn't anticipated, yet one that suddenly felt less solitary, and perhaps more meaningful than the lonely road he had been traveling. He watched her as Martha led her to the mission kitchen for some tea, her steps a little lighter, her head held a little higher. And Josiah Keyes, the wandering preacher, knew he'd done more than just answer a prayer. He'd perhaps, in the most unexpected of ways, begun to find an answer to his own. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts.